Okay, well, at this time then, we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is a panel discussion regarding the effects of new technology on NSCP. As you all know, at our most recent in-person meeting, which we held recently in Silicon Valley last May, we focused on the identification of emerging technology relevant to the government's national security and emergency preparedness missions. Today, we will talk about how such technology, as is recognized and embraced, is going to influence plans, processes, and procedures in pursuit of NSCP and other missions of this function. I want to thank Bud Tribble in advance for agreeing to lead the panel discussion with your esteemed panelists. So, Bud, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm Bud Tribble. I'm Vice President of Software Technology for Apple. And I want to welcome our panel today. The topic of this panel is effects of new technology on national security, emergency preparedness policies and procedures. And I think it's very topical. The effects of these new technologies are something that are going to happen to us no matter whether we want them to or not, so it's definitely worthwhile discussing them. To introduce our panel, to begin with, we have Dr. Evan Cook, Senior Policy Advisor, Office of Science and Technology Policy. Welcome. Dr. Edward Felton, Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer, OSTP. Welcome. Mr. Neil Ziering, Technical Director, Capabilities Directorate, NSA. Welcome. And Angela Simpson, Deputy Assistant Secretary, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, Department of Commerce. Thank you. And what I'd like to do is to sort of set the scene for this discussion and sort of lay out the topics we want to talk about, and then just get into some back and forth discussion about some of the issues that are brought up by this. As I said, the purpose of this panel is to support NSTAC's current examination of how the government might identify and adapt novel and emergency information and communication technology for the mission of national security and emergency preparedness. And specifically, we want to take a look at both the benefits and the risks of new off-the-shelf consumer technology. So not just commercial technology, but zoom in on consumer technology. And one reason for that is that is an area that is moving extremely rapidly. It's an area I'm very familiar with, and I think that it's really worthwhile looking at this from both the benefit and the risk side. And I think we have people on the panel who can speak to that. Now, why consumer technology? Well, government procurement of COTS technology, or commercial off-the-shelf technology, is not something new. And in fact, it got a big push in the early 90s. There was a famous memo called the Perry Memo. Perry was the chairman of the, or he was the Secretary of Defense in the 90s. And he published a memo expounding on the value of commercial off-the-shelf products for DoD, for the Defense Department, as opposed to single, small-run, purpose-built, built just for that project. And there was a myriad of reasons for doing that. But the main one is to take full advantage of this nation's ecosystem and infrastructure of R&D and building products, and not have to sequester that into smaller packages that are just not going to be as cost effective or even as effective as harnessing our full nation's ability to make these kinds of products. And there's a pattern here, especially apparent in consumer technology, where technology gets invented in a lab. It might be in a government lab, it might be in an industrial lab, and that technology tends to get applied first for some special purpose use. And it may be a government use, it may be a use within industry, but occasionally or often that technology finds its way into the consumer market. And when it finds its way into the consumer market, several things happen. it engages a larger part of the industrial base of the nation, because at this point you're talking about large volumes, large amounts of R&D flowing into that. I liken it to when in The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy's house gets picked up by the maelstrom and starts taking off into the sky. Once the technology finds itself in the consumer market, you have that effect takes place, and you take the technology to new heights it would never reach on its own in a niche market. And this has happened over and over again. It happened, for example, with the internet itself. Internet was developed by ARPA with the Defense Department funding. It was a small, insular group. Once the internet started being used for the web in the 90s, the investment in the internet, it went to scale and exploded. But you can point to other things as well. The personal computer itself got its start, of course, in World War II. Computers, mainframe computers, were exclusively within government R&D shops. And the integrated circuits that came in the 60s were developed for the space program. But when those two things joined in the personal computer, and over the next decades we started making computers by the hundreds of millions, that is when the R&D flowed in, the product functionality went through the roof, and that is the kind of thing that can never be replicated by an insular government one-off production facility. So, the challenge is, how can we take advantage of that for a specific mission? So national security, emergency preparedness, these devices were not made for that purpose. The question is, can they be adopted or adapted for that purpose? Many times the answer is yes, and that's sort of where the money is. In addition, many times what happens is what I call BYOD, bring your own device. What happens is that the employees, the government workers, end up bringing these devices into the workplace no matter what. And this has happened with personal computers, it's happened with cell phones, it's going to happen with other devices in the future. And the challenge will be to figure out, rather than treating these phenomenon as a nuisance, oh, don't bring that to work, figuring out how you can take those devices that have become part of someone's life and actually leverage them to do a more effective job at your mission. Now, a big challenge with these devices, and anyone in the government who has looked at using them, or even in the commercial world looking at using them, says the big challenge is to understand for these consumer devices, they weren't built for you or your use, but they do have a lot of capabilities and functionality. It's to understand what are that device's capabilities, and more important, what are that device's reliability, what's its resilience, what's its safety, what's its security. And only through understanding all of those aspects of this technology can you figure out, can we make a tweak here or a tweak there and adapt it for our mission? Or maybe you can't. Maybe it's just too far away from your mission and you're better off looking elsewhere. Discovering that is a key competitive advantage, because if you're the first government to figure out how to leverage this, if you're the first adversary to figure out how to leverage this, if you're the first company that figures out how to leverage this, you've got a leg up, because what you've done is you co-opted the billions and billions of dollars of R&D that went into these quite sophisticated objects and figured out how to use it for your mission. Just quick comment on some specific areas that I'm sure we'll get into, having to do with, okay, you've got these devices, they have computers in them, they might be a smartphone, they might be a wearable, they might be, we'll talk about some other kinds of devices on the horizon. Looking specifically at the cybersecurity of these devices, how do you evaluate them? The last thing you want to do is bring in something to your mission that's going to cause you a vulnerability in that space. And in fact, the federal government does give some help there. and has been giving some help. So, for example, the Department of Defense has what they call STIGs, which are Secure Technology Implementation Guides to help you configure and deploy these kinds of COTS, off-the-shelf devices, in a secure environment. NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, offers guidance in the form of things like FIPS 140-2, which are guidance for how to implement and configure encryption to enhance the security of these devices. The NSA has some guidance in the form of commercial solutions for classified, CSFC program, and I'm sure Neil may give a few words about that. It's how can you repurpose these commercial and consumer devices and get value out of them for your mission. Just a quick example of what this means in reality. So Apple came out with the iPad, and it became clear to a lot of airline pilots that in their flight bag they had pounds and pounds of maps, just in case they needed a map when they were flying. And they said, well, gee, an iPad can contain all the maps for the entire US, or in the entire world for that matter, in one iPad, a lot lighter, save fuel. But that wasn't the end of the story, because maps are something that when you're an airline pilot, you actually, these days, you don't need them that much. But if you do need them, you absolutely want them to be there. And, iPads have batteries. The batteries can run low. If you drop an iPad, occasionally it might crack the screen. But the end result was that the FAA said, okay, here's the new rule. Perfectly okay to put all your maps on your iPads, but you have to bring 2 of them with you. As long as there's 2 of them in the aircraft, there's no single point of failure, and you've met the requirements for safety and on the airplane. So it's that kind of thinking. You have a product that may not be perfect for your mission, but it's jam-packed with oodles of technology and R&D dollars and a lot of capability. How can you adapt it and adopt it to your particular mission? Now, and of course, goes without saying that the downside of ignoring those products is that you are leaving all of that R&D and industrial ecosystem on the table and not taking advantage of it for your mission. And the downside of that can be very serious as well. Okay, well, to bring in the panel, I'd like to just go around, do a first round, and give each of you a chance to say a few remarks along the lines of these topics, and raise any questions you want to raise for the other panelists, for me, and so just plan to take a few minutes and do that. So let's start with you, Evan.
Great, thank you, Dr. Tribble. Thanks to the chairman, and many thanks to this committee. This is certainly a group of some of the most innovative and interesting organizations and teams in the country, so we are very excited for the conversation this afternoon. My colleague Ed Felton and I are joining you from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where our team in the Office of the U.S. Chief Technology Officer seeks to leverage technology policy, data science, and innovation on behalf of the American people. So today we have 2 brief opening thoughts for the discussion today. The first, as set forth in the introduction from Dr. Tribble today, is that a range of technologies are reaching maturity with the potential for very large societal impact and national security impacts as well. This could be new forms of transportation enabled by autonomous vehicles or unmanned aerial systems, or new communication modalities and platforms that give us instant access to audience of millions or even billions today. The basic problem we face is that many departments and agencies don't have the institutional capacity to assess and respond given the rate of technological change. We see these challenges firsthand in our office, where we regularly see approaches to policy that may be a little bit too aggressive and introduce systemic or national security risks, or a little bit too conservative and overestimate the risks in ways that policymakers may not have foreseen or accounted for. Given the scope of the challenge ahead, it cannot be the intelligence community or the national security emergency preparedness communities alone who bear the responsibilities of flagging all these new threats and properly communicating the opportunities that these new technologies present. Speaking of opportunities, we briefly wanted to highlight and reinforce the incredible positive potential of many of these new technologies. For example, as devices and apps come into the hands of consumers that can provide fast and tailored messages, these technologies have the potential to transform aspects of the national security and emergency preparedness mission spaces, such as emergency notification. For example, the nation's primary warning system, the Integrated Public Alert and Warning System, or IPAWS, is currently too slow for earthquake early warning. The Shake Alert Early Warning System, which has been built through cooperation from university researchers, the USGS, State of California, as well as nonprofit and commercial collaborators, detects the start of an earthquake and sends electronic warning messages to cell phones and other devices faster than seismic waves can travel through the earth ahead of the shaking. People can get invaluable seconds of warnings if they are close to the epicenter, but only if the warning is issued quickly and inserted into a fast delivery system, such as the one that Dr. Tribble spoke about in the opening remarks. So we very much look forward to the questions, and thank you for the opportunity to participate this afternoon.
Thank you. Dr. Felton?
Because Evan and I work together, we prepared a single joint statement, so I'll reserve the time for questions.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Zering?
Okay, I didn't get to coordinate with Evan and Dr. Fulton, so I decided to look at, from my experience in the DoD and the intelligence community, what has helped parts of government understand emerging technologies and adopt and deploy them. And in my brief opening statement, I'd like to identify that there are two core issues that we in government often conflate, but I believe are more successful when we do them separately. And that is, first, finding and assessing these emerging technologies, looking at the commercial landscape, where that billions of dollars of investment is going next, and assessing those technologies for possible application into the national security, emergency preparedness, and other sort of government mission areas, such as intelligence, for example. But then the second function is, once those technologies are identified, understanding how to adopt, adapt, and leverage them takes a different kind of specialty, a deep understanding of the mission involved and how it might interface to these large investments and technologies. And not just the devices, but I think it's very critical to understand the infrastructures and underpinnings behind them, because that's often where the government interface must occur. So I'd like to suggest to the committee that separating those functions and then having them work together, right, and I can cite examples of this in the Q&A, will actually allow us to do this more quickly and more effectively than the way we're doing it.
Ms. Simpson?
I just want to echo everybody's thanks to the committee for its work and for thinking about emerging technologies in the NSCP space. I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective, being in the Department of Commerce and NTIA, and I have four things I want to raise briefly for NSTAC to think about as they continue to think about the issue of emerging technologies in the near term and in the next administration. But first, I just want to flag the very real opportunity that FirstNet has, both its activities and the activities in its sphere of influence that they're going to be having in this space in the next year or so. I mean, I think of it in terms of both the breadth of the adoption of the new technologies that FirstNet will have on state, local, emergency communicators, the applications that will be used and widely distributed to the users of FirstNet, and the impact that that could have on the NSCP mission nationwide. And also just to flag the work of the Public Safety Communications Research Program, PSCR, which is primarily a partnership between NIST, NTIA, with also collaboration with FirstNet and DHS. So the PSCR and NIST got $300 million from the Middle Class Tax Relief Act. And so those funds are starting to flow into the coffers. And so over the next several years through 2022, there's going to be a lot of interesting R&D work in the emergency communication space going on that is doing the adaptation of existing technologies in large part. And they're going to be working on things like future generation wireless, virtual or augmented reality in the public safety realm, location-based services, user interfaces, mission-critical voice. So those things I would just flag for the NSTAC as they're considering this issue. It might be an interesting thing to either learn more about or to loop into when you're doing your work on this area. The second thing I would just flag is, we've talked about the paradigm shift, and some of the materials talked about the paradigm shift between the government as being the drivers of new technologies and commercial uses being the drivers of new technologies. And I just wanted to emphasize the potential role of public-private partnerships as being a bridge to those paradigm shifts. And I think that that's been used effectively and can continue to be used effectively in this space. When government partners up with the private sector, either as early adopters or through challenges or other types of mechanisms, it allows certain functionalities to be considered and built in or adapted into new technologies that help the government mission and also down the line can help the consumer mission, be it things like resiliency, be it things like cybersecurity in the design phase of things versus as an afterthought. Be it things like encryption and stuff like that. So I would just flag that as something to think about as well. And it's something that's also happening in the PSCR space through collaborations and credos and grants and things like that. So that might be another way to think of it. Not so binary as like it's either consumer or it's government. Like there's a middle ground that can be leveraged. The third thing I would just suggest to keep in mind the importance of data technologies in impacting NSCP missions involving technology. When I think about this, I think about things like IoT and how the information can be used by public safety in that realm and how it can be used to advance the mission. And, although it might not be a communications technology per se, it's something that can definitely impact the mission and how public safety does its job. And then the fourth thing, kind of going back to what Greg was saying in terms of IT modernization and computer years and stuff like that, one thing I would encourage NSTAC to do is to keep in mind the fundamentals. And as you're thinking about new technologies and emerging technologies and what that can do for you, the non-cutting edge foundation can make or break new technologies. And it's something that the government needs to continually think about. Things like spectrum, things like backhaul capacity, things like fiber. High-level attention and support to these items really need to be done in order to foster new technologies and the government adoption of new technologies in the space. And this involves things like the IP transition and thinking about how the government procures, how it budgets, how it plans, and helping the government create the foundation for it to adopt new technologies and to effectively use them in the future. So those are just the four things I would flag, and thank you again for your work.
Great, thanks. Raises a couple questions in my mind. I like your last statement that, these sort of non-cutting edge technologies, excuse me, are important too. It brings to mind a community that gets a brand new fire truck and the roads are still dirt. Obviously, paying attention to our infrastructure in those respects. That's what all of this stuff rides on top of. Can you point to an example, a great example, or even, you know, a good example of a public-private partnership in this space that you think has worked or is working?
I mean, I would name FirstNet as an example of a public-private partnership. I mean, they're still in a procurement phase, but I mean, I think they're a terrific example of taking existing technology, LTE, adapting it further for public safety users in terms of resiliency, in terms of things like priority and preemption and mission-critical voice, voice as opposed to data. And so I think that that's a terrific example of leveraging an existing technology, making it better, broadly spreading it out amongst the community of first responders, and being very efficient at that at the same time. So that's one example that clearly comes to mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good model to keep in mind. It's a little bit different than just, you know, taking 2 iPads and calling it a day. What it is saying, well, we have this whole ecology that's been built up of handsets and communication infrastructure. Can we sort of use what we learned building the consumer infrastructure and sort of replicate that without having to reinvent the wheel as FirstNet? And I think that does do a lot of leveraging of that industrial ecosystem that built up that current net. I think and maybe you can speak to this, I think there's a slippery slope or a danger in once you get out there on sort of a branch that's not quite the same as what the billions of dollars went into, that you run the risk of building something in parallel and then kind of getting off the beaten path and making something that's just a little bit too different and sort of cutting yourself off from the branch. You want to comment on that?
I think it's definitely a valid point, and I think that, you know, one of the roles of the standards organizations and things like that hopefully will help avoid that type of situation, because I know that that's not you know, an ideal situation to happen. I think also PSCR and some of the research and development and testing work that they're doing in that space also can help prevent the problem that you raised. But it's definitely a good point.
Yeah, Neil?
But can I add a small bit to that? I think sort of goes to Angela's third point. We can't say, okay, we're only going to pay attention to the underpinning infrastructures. Those are essential. But these devices that everybody has, be they phones or drones or wearables, give their most value when they're hooked into data infrastructures on the back end, often living in a variety of clouds and elsewhere. And if we're going to take advantage of those, we have to be careful how we interface to them, both to you know, manage the cybersecurity risks and also to manage I guess the civil liberties, privacy, legal compliance sort of risks, where we in government live under very different rules than corporations that gather this data freely. And we have to be very careful how we make use of it, and the standards are a big part of that. But you know, taking that kind of care will be essential.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think that's true, although looking just over the horizon as to what's coming, it's clear to me that one thing that's coming is that there are enough radios that are ubiquitous in our environment, that mesh technologies that actually don't have a cloud backend or very little of it, and operate autonomously peer-to-peer between these devices, whether the devices are your watch or your car or whatever it is, your house. And so that's going to, it's going to raise a whole new set of issues and questions as to how can we leverage this for emergency preparedness, for example, when you potentially have a high population center that can, even before the cell towers on wheels come in, can stand up their own communication system. How can public safety leverage that? So I just want to put the high beams on a little bit there, and not everything is always going to be going back to the cloud. Evan, you had a
I wanted
question?
to add a quick point on top of Neil's good point about the devices and the data. So sometimes we focus a lot on the devices themselves, but it's also important to think about the data that is connected to those devices as well. And I offer that the committee could also look at data.gov/disasters, where in response to the Hurricane Sandy event, the White House held an Innovation for Disaster Response and Recovery initiative, where they brought together a bunch of different data sets and then brought together a community to act on those data sets to help in response. So it can be the devices, or it could be the data that is produced by those devices, or augment, or the data that is used by those devices that can be helpful in preparing to or responding to a natural disaster or emergency situation.
Yes, Ed?
I think one of the challenges here is the difficulty of government using some of these technologies in its day-to-day business, whether that's in the national security related work, or just in the ordinary work of government. And that comes about partly because of concerns about cybersecurity, where the government's needs may be different, or where there may be more assurance or process required. And it comes about partly because of legal requirements related to things like records retention, which commercial tools may not be set up to do. And I think there's a real issue here when government has trouble using these tools. It means that the folks who work in these agencies and who are involved in these decisions can be a step removed from the easy familiarity with the technology that is the best way to recognize its opportunities. And there's no simple answer to that, but I do think it's an issue that that will continue to be one of the limiting factors here.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, so part of the issue you mentioned were things like records retention and just different kinds of functionality, auditing functionality, where I think oftentimes there are ways to accomplish those, but one agency may have discovered it and another agency is in the dark about it. And so I think, intra-government sharing of sort of best practices on leveraging these things could be useful. And just a quick comment on cybersecurity, which is important to all of us. And in fact, more and more these days, obviously governments can be targets for certainly state actors in cybersecurity. But more and more these days, even consumers find themselves on the front lines of state actor cybersecurity. And so those same concerns and kinds of issues are also becoming issues to the manufacturers of these devices. And so I think there can be some convergence there. That said, I think coming from the consumer side of it, and maybe even coming from the government side of it, I think IBM did a study a couple years ago where they studied a large number of cybersecurity incidents, and they found like something like 95% of all of those incidents included human error as one of the factors. And so what we have here are devices that could be configured securely, but probably aren't. They could be updated, but they probably aren't. They could have a good password, but they probably don't. And so that is actually an area that the consumer industry is focused on. How can we make these devices secure out of the box? How can we make the security actually usable by people? So I think there's a good overlap there.
Sure. No, I agree that it's not inherently the case that consumer technologies are less secure. I think government is often hesitant to use something that wasn't invented here. And sometimes in the face of evidence that the invented here thing is not as good. No question about that. Government work and government agencies are also regulated in significant ways. And sometimes the structure of that regulation, the compliance and process requirements that are imposed by law can be barriers to changing how you do things in a way that would not be an impediment in an ideal world. And that's part of the issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, the FAA thing took a rule change, which didn't happen overnight, so yeah, that's true.
We probably have time for one more comment. Did you have something?
No, I thought you looked like you wanted to ask a question.
I just got a timekeeper, so. They close with me.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Evan, Ed, Neil, and Angela. We appreciate it, and Bud for leading us on that topic conversation. Thank you very much for being here. With that, I'm going to turn over to Scott Charney, who's the co-chair of our ETSB subcommittee, flying solo today without John, but you have an update for us.
Yes, I had a chance to speak with John yesterday, and he sends his regrets, and I will do double duty here for John and myself. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share an update on the NSTAC's Emerging Technology Strategic Vision, or ETSV, Research Subcommittee. The subcommittee has made significant progress since I last provided an update to this group. It has proceeded with the plan that I outlined in August, organizing its inquiry as a series of questions about forthcoming technology, impacts to national security and emergency preparedness, and budgetary authorities and procurement challenges. Many of the subcommittee's briefings have been focused on forthcoming innovations, preparing the subcommittee to describe the emerging and expected technology landscape, as well as the likely benefits and risks of forthcoming technologies, in particular in the context of national security and emergency preparedness, or NSEP missions. So far, briefers have discussed a range of technologies, including virtual reality, 3D printing, robotics, and biocomputing. The attention of many experts is focused on IoT, software-defined networking, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing. This constellation has helped the subcommittee consider and discuss a variety of near and longer-term impacts and trends, as I'll outline in a few moments. Going forward, the subcommittee's attention is also shifting to its final area of examination, which is focused on enabling the U.S. government's deployment and use of emerging and expected technologies. The subcommittee is considering the budgetary, procurement, and authorities-related challenges that delay the deployment or use of rapidly advancing technologies. These are important issues that continue to frustrate agency and department efforts and prevent the government and its citizens from benefiting from new technologies and security capabilities. Although these issues have received considerable attention in the past, they are also timely now, not only because of initiatives like the IT Modernization Fund and Modernizing Government Technology Act, but also because of the administration transition. To begin the report drafting process, organize learnings from briefers, and identify any remaining gaps in its study, the subcommittee has been working on a report outline. At a high level, the outline demonstrates how the report will structure a discussion about emerging and expected technologies, NSEP impacts, and findings and recommendations, including those related to addressing budgetary, procurement, and authorities-related challenges. The subcommittee has also highlighted the need to frame the report's security-related content in a way that's quickly accessible to and actionable for the report's readers. The subcommittee's most substantial progress has been made in developing a detailed outline of the section of the report that will describe the landscape of emerging and expected technologies. In particular, the subcommittee is using 3 categories and 4 thematic trends to organize its discussion of and convey the range of technologies that will be described in the report. Category 1 technologies are the nearest term and are transforming current ICT architecture and data storage. In the private sector, these technologies are already being deployed, and in the public sector, they're either already being deployed or will be relatively soon. Some examples of technologies in this category include software-defined networking, 5G, and IoT. Category 2 technologies, such as artificial intelligence and robotics, will not only transform existing ICT architectures, but also have broader social and economic impacts. They're being deployed in the private sector in rudimentary form, but are likely to mature and proliferate in the medium term. So the government needs to prepare for both direct and indirect impacts on the NSEP mission. Category 3 technologies, such as quantum computing and nanotechnology, mostly exist in R&D environments. Although timeliness for their maturity and deployment are speculative, they're worthy of government's attention now because they will fundamentally alter multiple disciplines and environments within ICT. To complement the 3 categories, which may inform the government's assessment of priorities, the subcommittee has also developed 4 thematic trends. While the categories are intended to help the government think about waves of innovation over time, the trends are intended to help the government recognize not only the functional impacts of various forthcoming technologies, but also the interdependencies between different advancements. The 4 trends are interconnectivity and processing power, production and simulation, analytics, cognition and autonomy, and trust and verification. New technologies are being developed and deployed across all 4 of these trends, and the advancements within one trend will lay the groundwork for further advancements in others. For example, increasingly powerful functionality, as well as faster, more dynamic, and more resilient communication between and among many billions of devices will impact progress in analytics, cognition, and autonomy. In the near term, software-defined networking will support advancements in machine learning, AI, and robotics. And in the longer term, quantum computing will likely support further innovations across all of these technologies as well. In addition to highlighting the impacts of and interdependencies between each of the 4 trends, the subcommittee is assessing challenges and risks. Many forthcoming technologies may create both new opportunities for resilience and new vectors for attack. They may also be cultural uncertainty or educational or training gaps that impact technology uptake, integration, and use. As the subcommittee continues to build out its outline and moves forward towards drafting the final report, an important next step is to focus on our recommendations. In particular, the subcommittee will be thinking about 3 sets of recommendations. First, what things should the government do right now? These recommendations will likely relate mostly to Category 1 technologies, but there may be also be things the government should do now to prepare for the impact of longer-term developments, such as promote crypto agility so that the transition to quantum-resistant encryption is more seamless. Second, what current things should the government stop doing or perhaps do differently? For example, in a world of virtual machines, do old notions about inventorying assets still work? And if not, how should the government think about preserving critical assets? Third, how should the government address longer-term trends in technologies like strong AI and quantum computing? How should it think about research and development as well as training the workforce for this forthcoming environment? Lastly, I would like to mention the President's Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity's report on securing and growing the digital economy, which was released last week. That effort, established last February and involving a group of highly respected ICT and cybersecurity experts, including a former NSTAC chair, is intended to inform this administration in its final weeks, as well as serve as a baseline assessment and set of recommendations for the incoming administration. By my own preliminary review, while many of the Commission's recommendations are of a more immediate and tactical nature, particularly in comparison to our longer-term approach, I see our effort as potentially additive to the Commission's work. For instance, the Commission makes recommendations on IoT, authentication and identity, and procurement reform, all areas that we are exploring in depth. Therefore, I recommend the subcommittee closely study the Commission report and consider areas of alignment as appropriate, remaining independent per our ongoing obligations under the NSTAC Charter and establishing executive order. In closing, let me note that the subcommittee has been adhering to the timeline that I first shared with this group in May. That is, it expects to complete its study and finalize its report by next May's member meeting. As we are all aware, this report will be presented to the next administration, which may have a different set of priorities or inquiries than the Obama administration has pursued. With that in mind, we intend to share a brief overview of our draft findings and recommendations in February to seek the Trump administration's feedback. If there is substantial feedback, then we may revise our timeline to ensure that we can be responsive to the issues or questions that may be identified. Otherwise, we'll work to finalize our report by May. I hope this has been a useful overview of the subcommittee's approach, progress, and plan going forward. With the remainder of my time, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you as well to John for leading the subcommittee. I'll open it up to the members. If any questions for Scott or John this time? Great. We'll look forward to February then.
Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to turn the meeting over now to Renee and Suzanne to provide some remarks on studies, processes, and other works by NSTAC that led to the development of the National Cyber Incident Response. Renee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Renee James, Oracle. It's an honor to be with Suzanne today. Thank you for coming. She's, I think everyone knows who she is. But what we would like to do is just reflect briefly on how the NSTAC partnership with the government has worked, and in particular look at the unique value in framing the solutions on national security and emergency preparedness and cybersecurity. So we're going to look at this NSTAC's support in the development of the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. What do you call it, the NSERP? Yep, NSERP. We call it the NSTAC. So 2 years ago, the NSTAC did a study in 2014, like the one that Scott just updated on a different topic, on the topic of information, communications, and technology mobilization. And it specifically focused on how commercial capabilities or functions could be operationally coordinated to address a national security event that had a large cyber component. In the ICT mobilization study, which was requested by the National Security Council of the Executive Office of the President, I believe that was Michael, the NSTAC defined and developed the robust methodology or model for assessing a cyber event, establishing a context and a situational risk assessment framework, and specifically, the report identified conditions, triggers, and thresholds that might require increased operational coordination across industry, identified critical commercial assets, functions, and capabilities that would be helpful or necessary in a response, and recommended an operational framework that allowed for agile, effective, and distributed implementation across numerous stakeholders. It guides, informs, and prioritizes the response across the full spectrum of the NSEP events with cyber implications. And finally, identified an operational structure or a construct to coordinate the assets at each threshold. The NSTAC ICT mobilization study conceptually modeled its cyber response framework after the 5-tier DEFCON process. The breakthrough of the report, however, noted that large-scale cyber responses are different because it's not necessarily just the government that can fully respond or orchestrate a response. In fact, mobilization will undoubtedly require industry and industry participation. In particular, the NSTAC recognized that the nature of the threat places all national equities in the NSEP space, governmental and commercial, at risk. Accordingly, all such equities can expect to become targets and to receive damage. Capability to protect and respond is found in many ways in many places across the national ICT space. All of those across government and industry who are engaged in such protective efforts benefit from closer collaboration than have been seen to date at the time we wrote this, which is considered possibly using historic opportunistic processes or authorities. Thus, a national readiness and response framework would be required. In this study, we proposed one, which accounts for measured and controlled escalation and de-escalation in response to ever-changing conditions. The public-private approach outlined by the NSTAC was a quantum step beyond anything previously contemplated or attempted in U.S. cyber defense planning. And with the government's leadership, this framework could serve as an international template to ensure the availability, confidentiality, and integrity of global assets in a response. These concepts were first rigorously articulated in the NSTAC ICT mobilization study. The study appears to have contributed several critical elements to the subsequent government effort in this area, and most notably to the revised NSERP. Since the NSERP is currently being finalized, we thought it would be helpful for the members to see the degree with which the NSTAC recommendations were reflected and incorporated into the plan. So let me cite a few specifics where the NSTAC's influence into NSERP was noted. First, in scale. How bad is it? The NSTAC developed an escalation model and impact scale by reviewing real assets, evaluating each asset's risk and assessment, and establishing a major parameters for the criteria for assessing cyber events. Next, the question was, is this business as usual or is this an elevated issue? And meaning, when do we convene this? Cyber incidents happen on an ongoing basis. The vast majority of those incidents pose no demonstrable risk to the U.S. national security interests, foreign relations, public confidence, etc. Such cyber incidents are resolved either by the affected entity alone or with routine levels of support from and in coordination with other private sector stakeholders. This was reflected in the model, that not everything is a tier 1 event. Building on its escalation model, the NSTAC identified the stages in the escalation process at which industry would likely need support from government, or to alter or expand authorities to facilitate emergency private sector actions. At its most extreme, what the NSTAC called the red event, we're dealing with questions such as continuity of government, full-scale national emergency, in which the government has the authority to direct priorities for protection. Consistent with this thought process, the NSERP calls for the formation of a Cyber Unified Coordination Group, UCG, as the primary method for coordinating between and among federal agencies and integrating private sector partners into significant cyber incident responses. Third, the report suggested, once action was required, a framework for who do you call. That was one of the questions that we had. Who knows who to call at the point of a red event? The NSTAC identified certain ICT actors that might be more important in supporting incident management for cyber crisis of national significance. We identified these organizations and referred to them as ICT enablers. They're key players for providing core capabilities that contribute to the overall functioning and viability of the cyber ecosystem. In the words of the study, while the victim, quote, while the victims changed with each incident or scenario we reviewed, the NSTAC found that certain ICT functions were consistently part of creating the solution and were leveraged to assist in implementing the solution in every response. The NSERP draws directly on the NSTAC mobilization study, noting that a cyber unified coordinated group, the basic organizational construct defined for multi-party cyber response, might also incorporate specific ICT companies, also known as ICT enablers. It's these ICT enablers who are often best positioned to share information, ensure engagement of key players across the internet and the ICT realm, and also assist with large-scale response efforts during a significant cyber event. These lines and these concepts in this operational framework, which they refer to, are all explicitly based on the NSTAC vision for leadership. The fourth issue that we suggested in the report were global norms. In addition to the conceptual models, the NSTAC also articulated a set of principles designed to ensure actions taken by government respected the fundamentally different nature of government and private sector activities and entities. These included ideas that in taking action to mobilize the private sector assets in response to a major cyber event, the government must be transparent, inclusive, and respectful of the complexities of international business environments. We noted the concerns acknowledged in the NSERP's guiding principles associated with respecting affected entities and enabling restoration and recovery as a response to that topic. Finally, we made a commentary, although not the primary focus of the NSTAC study, on legal issues. The study did raise the issue of the possibility that a severe cyber event would require rapid action by the government to adjust, enhance, or grant new kinds of legal authorities, waivers, and exemptions, and this too is reflected in the NSERP. In summary, with the release of the executive order and the development of the NSERP, it would appear that the framework will now be in place to move forward in partnership with industry and complete the recommendations made by the NSTAC. And And with that, I want to thank Suzanne and her team. I think it's important, and one of the reasons I wanted to report out on that is we do a lot of work here, a lot of hard work, a lot of work like what Scott is doing, and I think it's important for not only the members but the public to know that the government does take our recommendations quite seriously. With that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Spalding.
Thank you, Renee, and again, thanks to all of you. As I indicated earlier today when we were together, I think this is a really terrific example, but just one example of the impact that your work is having on improving national security, emergency preparedness, communications, and cybersecurity, and assisting us in our mission to work with you to make that happen. And so I really appreciated the time on the agenda today to walk through, to have Renee walk through in some detail, that crosswalk between your ICT mobilization report and the National Cyber Incident Response Plan. As Renee indicated, the plan was something that the President asked DHS to put together with our federal partners, our state, local, territorial, tribal partners, our private sector partners, as part of the tasking from PPD 41. And PPD 41, of course, was the document issued in July by the President that described how the federal government will be organized and is organized to address a significant cyber incident. And it describes 3 key lines of effort that will happen largely concurrently in the event of a significant cyber incident. It talks about asset response, which is led by DHS, which is coming in the event of a significant cyber incident, helping the victim or victims figure out what's going on in their system, get the malicious actor out, and restore and recover. And then we work with law enforcement, which leads, FBI leads the threat response, which is to figure out who did this and try to go after the malicious actors. And then together we work to identify potentially future victims or victims that may be currently experiencing the same kind of malicious activity and get the information that network defenders need to them as quickly as possible. And that dissemination is a key part, information sharing is a key part of DHS's mission. The analogy we often use is if the house is on fire, right, this is a significant cyber incident, you can think of DHS as being the firefighters who come in to help put out the fire, and then law enforcement will come in to figure out how the fire, who started the fire and go after the arsonist. And then there's a third line of activity, which is the intelligence response, which is largely our intelligence community, which will be trying to provide context and further information using intelligence authorities to help us better understand and again help inform network defenders going forward. So it described largely again how the federal government is organized, but in PPD 41 there's an acknowledgement, as Renee said, that there's a fourth very significant line of effort, and that is the private sector line of effort. The affected entity itself and other partners who can help to address the situation. And the charge to really bring that in with greater granularity was to the NSERP. It was to DHS to address in this National Cyber Incident Response Plan. And so one of the very first places that our team went as they started to refresh the draft NSERP that had been sort of kicking around, frankly, since 2009, was to the NSTAC ICT mobilization report. And to the well-thumbed pages and their marginal notes and their highlights to say, okay, now let's put these things into practice. And so it really was a very significant help. And as has been noted, things like the severity index that's right up front in the NSERP is a direct correlation to the NSTAC recommendation. The circumstances under which a unified cyber coordination group will be convened and how that will operate. the importance of coordinating that effort with any other UCGs that maybe stood up, in recognition that a significant cyber incident is likely to have significant physical consequences that are also being addressed, perhaps by an overlapping but different set of actors. And so, you know, the mechanisms by which those things will be coordinated. And then I thought a particularly important part of the NSERP, which is you know, marching down, and this is again tracking with the NSTAC report, the capabilities and functions, the core functions that will be necessary for an effective response to a significant incident, and the capabilities that are required to achieve those functions. So what I've asked our staff to do is to come back now with a plan, recommendation for leadership on how we will track that development of those core capabilities, because that is obviously a very important next step. We are still finalizing the NSERP. We put it out for draft, the draft out for broad public and private sector comment. This is in addition to the private sector involvement in the working groups. In fact, the private sector was brought into this discussion before the PPD even was issued, because we knew this was coming. We knew we had a tight time frame. And so back in March, we reached out to all the sector coordinating councils to ask for POCs to begin to pull together the organization to make this happen and make sure we had enough time for full private sector input and consultation. And even then in October, we put this out again for even broader public and private comment, 30-day comment period. We received over 800 individual comments. And we are working those through now, and we are going to meet the deadline that the President gave us to have this to him by January. So just by way of saying thank you very much, and to reassure you that, in fact, all of the time and effort you're spending here is really making a difference.